everybody, it's Tim with Uniform Members for Christ. Thanks so much for joining me today. Our topic is the church. What is it? This is part one of a three-part teaching. So if you want updates or notifications when our videos are being released, you can hit the little bell and subscribe to the channel, and that'll give you notifications whenever we release videos, which will be every Friday at 3 p.m. So, the church, what is it? It may sound like an overly simplistic topic, right? The church is where we go to worship. But I think there's a little more to it than that, and I think we can show you that today in this teaching. Part one of this is going to deal specifically with what the church is, and part two of the video, when we release it, we'll be talking about the leadership in the church, and then part three will be talking about the disciples or the believers in general. And each of those will talk about the roles and responsibilities and the expectations of leadership and of the assembly. For our teaching today, we're going to look at Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, where Jesus said, "I will build my church." Now, if we're English thinkers, right, English speakers, we're going to think, okay, church, we'll kind of get this image in our head. But Jesus was speaking to a Jewish crowd, a Jewish audience, and he was also speaking to people that were heavily influenced by a Greek culture. That's what the New Testament was written in. So, when he used the word for church in Greek, he actually used the word ekklesia. That word is very important to us today because it would have invoked a very different image in a Greek thinker's mind than the word church invokes in an English thinker's mind. So let's explore a little. I want to go to the outline of biblical usage, which you can find in a concordance. I like to use Blue Letter Bible. I'll link that for you in the description. The ekklesia, we're only going to use two of the definitions today out of the outline of biblical usages. One of them is a gathering of citizens called out from their home into some public place or an assembly. And the second one is a company of Christians or of those who are hoping for eternal salvation through Jesus Christ that observe their own religious rites, they hold their own religious meetings, and they manage their own affairs according to the regulations prescribed. That gives us an idea what the church is, but it still doesn't tell us exactly what a person that would have heard Jesus using that word for the first time would have thought. For that, we might actually want to use a secular resource. We're going to use Britannica.com for that. And they said that the ekklesia became synonymous with a body of male citizens that were 18 years of age or over and had final control over policy, including the right to hear appeals in public court. They could take part in the election of chief magistrates, which we'll discuss that below. And they could confer special privileges on individuals. Now, obviously, Jesus didn't intend for the church to be a mirror image of a Greek ekklesia. But I think you'll find it very interesting how many similarities there are between the word ekklesia and what we see in the book of Acts as the church. Let's start with a gathering of people that have been called out of their homes into a public place. I probably don't need to say a lot about this, because all throughout the New Testament, we see a group of believers leaving their homes and gathering together somewhere else. The writer of Hebrews, or the author of Hebrews, said this in chapter 10, verses 24 and 25. It said, "Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. Don't neglect to meet together. Some people make a habit of that. But encourage one another, especially as you see the day drawing near." So there's obligations that the assembly has, right? That is written directly to all of us. There's no one particular person who has that obligation. All of us are told to consider how we can stir each other up to love and good works. And we're also told not to neglect meeting together. So I think that's fairly straightforward. Let's look at the second point. What was the second thing the ekklesia had the right to do? They had final control over policy. So we find that early on in the book of Acts, around chapter 15, Paul and Barnabas were on an extended missionary journey. When they arrived at Antioch, the whole church gathered together, and they were teaching them for a while. At some point, other disciples from Judea came down, and they began to teach the church that you needed to be circumcised in order to be in compliance with the law of Moses and really be right with God. Well, Paul and Barnabas didn't agree with this. And it says there was a pretty big debate that rose up in the local assembly between Paul and Barnabas and these other disciples. Well, they couldn't reach a conclusion on what was right. So the local church, the ekklesia that was gathered together, sent Paul, Barnabas, and some of their own disciples to go and talk to the apostles about this matter that were in Jerusalem. It's very interesting. It says that they brought the matter to the apostles and to the elders, and that the whole church welcomed them. This is not something we're going to get into today, but it'll be important for later. But you'll notice that it talks apostles, elders, and church. That's critical, because although apostles and elders are certainly part of the ecclesia, not all of the ecclesia are apostles or elders. Likewise, although the apostles were elders, not all elders were apostles. Very critical point there. So they come together, they present this matter. This is very intriguing. Okay, so they present this matter to the apostles and to the elders, and there's a good bit of deliberation. And it says some of those in the party of the Pharisees rose up and they begin to say, yeah, you know what? We need to be in compliance with the law of Moses. Those that are converted, that are Gentiles, let's just say in this case Greeks, that had not been under the law of Moses, they're not Jews, they had not been circumcised. Yes, they need to be circumcised. And the disciples and the apostles, the elders, they're hearing this matter and they're considering what's being said. And you may say, Pharisees, that sounds weird. Well, actually, they were converted Pharisees, if you will. They still were part of the party of the Pharisees, but they believed that Jesus was Messiah. All right. And at the end of this, it says that Peter kind of rose up among all of them, and he gave a discourse on why he didn't agree with the need to be circumcised. And then afterwards, it says Paul and Barnabas, they told of all the works that God was doing throughout the church. And then afterwards, James stood up and he delivered the final address on the matter. Basically, we see here a ruling body that came together to make policy. They made it a policy that circumcision not necessary for salvation. That's the first instance we see of policy. Now, you may say, well, that is the apostles. That happened then. Just remember, it was attempted to be sorted out within the local church at Antioch. It could not be. So they sought higher authorities in this particular case. Okay, so what's the second thing that the ecclesia had the right to do? Well, it said that they were able to take place in public hearings, public court hearings. Does that sound like the church at all? You may think that sounds actually kind of weird, but let's consider an example that the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. He says, when one of you has a complaint against the other person, do they dare go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that we're going to judge angels? How much more then should we be able to judge matters pertaining to this life? But brother goes to law against brother, and before unbelievers. He's astounded that those that are brothers and sisters in Christ would dare go to an unrighteous court or a secular court to have their matters heard. And he says, don't you know that you're able to make these judgments in the church, in the ecclesia? So we can already see right there that this Greek idea of ecclesia, where they had the right to take place in these public court hearings or public appeals, we see an example of that early on in the church at Corinth. Now we're going to talk a lot more about the assembly's responsibility in judging certain matters later on in our third teaching, our third part of this series. The next was they were permitted to take place in the election of chief magistrates. Now if you're anything like me, you may have trouble understanding and wrapping your mind exactly around what a chief magistrate is. The easiest way to sum it up, the position or the office highest in its particular class. One quick example would be when the apostles were down to 11 because of Judas's transgression, and they needed to replace that person and get back up to the number of 12 apostles. We remember that. It was Matthias, right? He was the one that was selected to that position. Although it's not exactly something that the assembly did, the general ecclesia, right? That was more specific to the apostles. A better example, perhaps for us, is in Acts chapter 6, when there was a situation that arose among the widows. Some of the Greek-speaking widows didn't feel like they were receiving fair treatment along with the Jewish widows. So the apostles called together the full number of the disciples. So they made an assembly. They brought them together for a specific purpose. And they said, you guys choose 7 people among yourself. And here's the criteria for selection. They need to be of a good report, good repute, full of the Spirit, and they need to be full of wisdom. And when you've chosen them, you bring them before us and we'll pray for them. So the assembly came together. They chose 7 men that met the criteria. They brought them before the apostles. The apostles prayed and laid hands on them. So that's a very good example there of appointment to people in certain positions. Okay. Last but certainly not least, they're allowed to confer special privileges on individuals. In 1 Timothy 4:14, do not neglect the gift you have, which was given you by prophecy when the council of elders laid their hands on you. Timothy received some type of spiritual gift that was imparted to him obviously by God and through the will of the Spirit, as is scriptural, yet it was applied through the laying on of the hands of the elders. One side note here is that the word elder, bishop, and presbyters are used interchangeably throughout the King James Bible. So what have we learned so far? Jesus used the word ecclesia, which would have elicited a very specific image in the minds of those who heard him. Instead of using a very common term for a Jewish society, synagogue, he used a word that was common to a Greek society, ecclesia. They would have understood a few things about this immediately. One, Jesus said, I am going to build my church, which means the obligation was upon him to establish it, to choose it, to structure it, to organize it, and he's the head of it. More than that, they would have understood that they had the right to make policies. We already saw that happen in the book of Acts, right, when they talked about circumcision. They could judge matters pertaining to the assembly. We saw that Paul clearly addressed the Corinthians and told them that they should have been addressing certain matters inside the body, inside the assembly, and not out in front of the unrighteous. We saw leaders appointed. Not only did it happen in the book of Acts, but it carried on throughout the entire course of the New Testament. And lastly, confer special privileges on people. We see frequently the apostles laying their hands on people and then receiving the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And then we see later on that the assembly of elders put their hands on Timothy, prayed for him, and he received some type of spiritual gift to assist him in his mission. Now, these are certainly not the only functions of the church. There are a few other things for you to consider that the church is called to take part in. Support leaders financially. We can find that in 1 Timothy 5:17-18. Send financial donations to those in need. Acts 11:27-30. We see in Acts chapter 6 that there was a feeding ministry for those who were widows. And there's criteria for widows that are outlined in the Bible as well. We were called to worship God together corporately. That's 1 Timothy 2:8. Exercise spiritual gifts in an orderly way. That's 1 Corinthians 14:23-33. And last but certainly not least is judge prophetic statements. 1 Corinthians 14:29. Now those are only a few of a lot of things that the assembly is called together, and you can make your own list. Just remember, next week, next Friday, 3 p.m., we will be discussing the appointment of elders within the church. Who are they? What's their mission and what's their role? And then the following Friday, we'll be discussing those of us that are disciples of Jesus, that we come together for a purpose. Well, what purpose is that? What things do we have the right to do that maybe we're not doing? We'll discuss that in part 3. Thanks again for joining me.